Tonight you are getting a calm New York crime Christmas, with warm bakery windows, quiet doorways, and soft tension that never gets too loud. Follow Nico as he runs pastries through Little Italy, Brooklyn, Queens, and the Village, where even tough people try to keep December polite. Chapter 1: Snow on Mulberry Street. The bakery on Grand Street stayed awake when most of the neighborhood went quiet, not glamorous awake, not working awake, with flour dust drifting like clean snow and ovens sighing in warm cycles, while the radio stayed low so it did not start the dough. Nico Lanza moved through it all with the steady pace of someone who had learned that speed was not the goal, because the goal was arriving with everything intact and letting other people keep their moods. Nico was a delivery driver, not a hero, not a mastermind, and not the kind of person who gave New York an excuse to notice him. He had a calm face and a useful habit of speaking less than expected, which was a kind of social currency in a city that collected too many stories. Aunt Rosa ran the bakery the way some people ran their whole lives, with discipline, pride, and a wooden spoon that felt like a legal opinion if you questioned her timing. Before he left, she watched him stack plain cardboard boxes into his car and reminded him to keep every lid level and every corner supported, because if anything opened by mistake, he would be unalived by embarrassment before anyone even had time to feel sorry for him. Nico promised he would be careful, and he meant it, because Aunt Rosa did not believe in casual promises. From her, even kindness came wrapped like an order. His first stops were easy: a fruit stand that paid in cash and gratitude, and a small restaurant that pretended it did not crave cannoli even though it ordered them like clockwork. By the time he reached the edge of Little Italy, the snow stopped being a rumor and became a plan, falling in soft flakes that made the streetlights look hazy and forgiving. Mulberry Street looked like a movie set that had been used too many times, with garlands drooping from awnings and strings of lights reaching across the street like shy hands, and tourists wandering with wide eyes and thin jackets that were already losing the argument with winter. Nico drove slowly, not only because the road was glossy, but because slow driving gave you time to notice what you needed to notice, and to miss what you should pretend not to see. He parked near Prince Street, said a short prayer to the gods of Manhattan parking, and stepped into the cold with 2 boxes held steady against his chest. He did not like attention, and he did not like surprises, so he delivered the way a careful waiter served soup, with both hands and no sudden turns. He walked toward a narrow doorway that did not look important, which was often the point around here, because important places like to look boring on purpose. The Ravenite social club was nearby, a name Nico did not need to say out loud because the neighborhood carried it in the way people carried winter scarves, as something you acknowledged without making a performance of it. Nico had never been inside, and he did not want to be, because interest could become obligation, and obligation was expensive. A man in a dark coat stood near the doorway, not blocking it, just owning the air around it, with neat hair, a polite expression, and eyes that did quiet mass. He greeted Nico with a simple evening and quickly identified him as the bread kid, which told Nico that his routine was not as invisible as he enjoyed imagining. Nico answered with the respectful "yes, sir" he used when he wanted to keep things smooth, and the man nodded like he had confirmed that the universe was still following its rules. With a small gesture, the man invited him inside. The hallway warmth hit Nico like a blanket, and somewhere behind a door he heard careful laughter that sounded friendly but measured, like people enjoying themselves without forgetting where they were. A younger man in a stylish scarf approached and took the boxes with 2 hands as if they were delicate, joking that Aunt Rosa still made him work in weather like this, and Nico replied that she believed work kept the bones from rattling. The younger man snorted and tried to hide it, the way an eager person tried to seem relaxed. The younger man carried the boxes down the hall and set them on a side table where envelopes and wrapped parcels formed a tidy pile, evidence that Christmas had arrived with paper and ribbon, even if it had not arrived with innocence. From deeper in the apartment, a slow voice floated out, explaining that the whole philosophy of life was keeping the cannoli cold and the coffee hot, and Nico did not need to see the speaker to understand that the speaker was the kind of person who took his time even when time was not available. The younger man checked a slip and counted bills with quick fingers, folding them into an envelope and placing it in Nico's hand, not tossing it, because money in this neighborhood was handed over like a contract. Nico tucked it into his inner pocket, the safe pocket, the pocket Aunt Rosa would approve of, and he turned to leave with the good sense of someone who knew his role in the scene was to arrive, deliver, and exit, before the room remembered him too clearly. Near the door, the man in the dark coat asked, as casually as a snowflake, whether Nico was doing the Mulberry run tonight, and Nico confirmed it, and then the man asked if he had heard anything strange out there. Nico answered no, because it was true and also because no was often the safest truth, and the man seemed satisfied. Outside again, Nico exhaled and watched his breath vanish into a soft, snowy air. He headed to his next stop, a late-night cafe where espresso kept people awake when their home lives did not feel welcoming, and Sal the owner was wiping down the counter as if it had offended him personally. Sal complained that Nico was late, and Nico blamed the slow snow, and Sal replied that snow was always slow, which was why it stuck around, like Sal's cousin. Then, as always during Christmas week, Sal slipped Nico a small bag of biscotti for Aunt Rosa while pretending it was nothing, and Nico accepted it like the small, meaningful trade it was. Back outside, Nico noticed a car idling across the street that did not look like a taxi or a rideshare, with its engine steady and headlights off, and a driver who was more shadow than face. Nico did not stare at it because in Manhattan everything could be normal if you acted like it was normal. He unlocked his car and slid into the seat with careful calm, like someone walking past a sleeping dog. On the passenger seat sat a small taped box he did not remember placing there, and it had no label and no friendly bakery tape, only neat, smooth tape that felt serious, like it belonged to an office that believed in order. Nico stared for a moment because the brain needed that moment to catch up, and then he whispered that this was not good, because whispering turned fear into something smaller. He checked the back seat, confirmed his remaining boxes matched his list, and concluded that this new box did not belong to him, to Aunt Rosa, or to anything he enjoyed having near his knees. He lifted it carefully, noticing it was heavier than it looked. Not wildly heavy, just heavy enough to imply a secret. He could have driven away, and that would have been the simple choice. But simple choices sometimes became complicated later, and complicated later was louder. Aunt Rosa always insisted the bakery did not play games, because the bakery fed people, and games fed trouble. So Nico turned the key, started the engine softly, and drove back toward that narrow doorway even though instinct suggested avoiding it. Parking was worse now, but New York occasionally offered a small mercy, and he found a spot, stepped into the snow, and carried the box tucked under his coat like a loaf of bread. The man in the dark coat raised an eyebrow when he saw Nico return so quickly, and Nico explained that he had something that was not his. The man did not move much, and the air around them felt thinner for a moment, but he held his hands out and accepted the box, weighing it lightly as if checking the balance of the world. He asked where Nico got it, and Nico told him it was on the passenger seat and he had not put it there. The man gave a slow nod and the polite expression cooled. He observed that maybe someone liked Nico, and Nico, answering before his own caution could negotiate, admitted he would rather be disliked. For half a second it looked like the man might smile, but he chose not to, and he turned and carried the box inside. Nico waited in the hallway under a small Christmas wreath, already losing needles, because even decorations got tired in this city. From behind a door came muted voices, not angry and not loud, just precise, with someone noting that the box was not even wrapped, and someone else replying that it should be kept intact because they did not need surprises this week. Then the slow voice from earlier drifted in, amused, explaining that Christmas was for surprises, just not the kind that came in tape. Nico stood very still and tried not to imagine anything detailed, because imagination could be worse than reality when you were tired. The door opened and the man returned and told Nico he did the right thing, and Nico shrugged and replied that the alternative was keeping an extra box, which did not feel like a hobby worth starting. The man called it a smart answer. An older man appeared behind him, smaller, cheeks flushed from warmth, wearing a sweater too soft for the reputation that seemed to follow him. He looked Nico over like a painting with an unclear price tag and confirmed that Nico drove for Rosa. Nico agreed, and the older man remarked that Rosa made good bread, too good, bread that made people weak, and Nico responded with a polite thank you because he did not want to test the tone of the room. The older man waved away gratitude like cigarette smoke and looked past Nico toward the street, toward the idling car that still waited in the snow. Without raising his voice, he directed a message toward the window, explaining that whoever was sitting over there could go home because Santa was not stopping here tonight, and the idling car rolled forward, turned the corner, and vanished into the winter like it had never existed. Nico felt his shoulders loosen by a fraction, and he kept his face steady because steady faces were cheaper than panic. The older man turned back to him and told him to pass along a Merry Christmas to Rosa, and Nico promised he would. Then the older man asked that Nico take a paper bag, and the younger man placed it in Nico's hands, folded tight and warm, smelling of sugar and chestnuts, filled with pastries not listed on any slip. The older man explained that it was for Nico because he came back, and that people forgot to do that, and Nico thanked him and tried to keep the gratitude simple. Outside again, the snowfall softened the streetlights and made even hard buildings look briefly forgiven. Nico finished the rest of his deliveries in a steady loop, and the shadow car did not return. When he got back to the bakery, Aunt Rosa was waiting behind the counter with her arms crossed, which was her usual posture for both love and judgment. She noted he was late, and Nico blamed the slow snow like everyone else in New York, and then he set the warm paper bag on the counter and explained it was for her. Aunt Rosa opened it, inhaled, and went quiet for a beat, and then she looked up and demanded to know who it was from. Nico answered that it was from the neighborhood, and Aunt Rosa snorted and reminded him that the neighborhood did not give, it traded, and Nico agreed without arguing because Christmas week was not a week for arguments. She reached out and tapped his cheek with a flour-dusted finger, a gesture that looked harsh until you understood her, and she told him he did good tonight, which was as close as she came to praise. Nico washed his hands, helped stack trays and listened to the ovens breathe, and before dawn he thought again about the box that was not his, about returning it, and about how the line between foolish and brave could be as thin as a snowy street. Then he chose simpler thoughts, warm bread, soft light, flour settling, and a Christmas that asked for patience instead of trouble. He leaned against the counter and let the hum of the bakery slow his mind to a lullaby pace. Chapter 2: Brooklyn Lights and Borrowed Cheer. The next night the snow stopped, but the cold stayed like a stubborn guest, and the sidewalks were salted and crunchy underfoot. The sky was a clean dark lid over the city, and Christmas felt close enough to smell, mixed with exhaust and roasted nuts and the faint promise of pine. Nico started earlier because Aunt Rosa declared that Christmas week required extra deliveries, and her logic stayed simple, since people were either trying to be better or trying to look better, and both moods demanded pastry. He loaded the car with boxes and bags and a special tray of rainbow cookies that Aunt Rosa guarded like state secrets, and she reminded him to be careful with those, as if he had ever chosen chaos on purpose. Nico assured her he was always careful, and her stare made that sentence lose confidence, because her stare could make a confident man question his own name. Nico found the bridge and crossed the river, watching the lights on the water look like scattered coins, not the kind you picked up, the kind you stared at and pretended you understood. Brooklyn met him with a steadier rhythm than Manhattan, because Manhattan felt sharp and watchful, while Brooklyn felt grounded and certain of its own history. He drove past row houses wearing wreaths and plastic reindeer-like uniforms, and some houses blinked gently, while others blinked like they were yelling, and Nico preferred the gentle ones because the yelling ones felt like warnings dressed as decoration. His first stop was a small social club above a hardware store, with a simple sign that did not advertise much, and wet steps that demanded respect. The door opened before he knocked, and a heavy-set man stood there with calm eyes and hands that looked like they had built half the city, wearing a sweater with a stitched reindeer that looked embarrassed about being involved. The man identified Nico as Rosa's delivery boy and invited him in before the cold convinced him to start complaining. And Nico joked that if he complained, Aunt Rosa would hear it from across the river. Inside, warmth and food smells wrapped around him, and the kitchen table held trays of seafood salad and fried smelts and a mountain of bread, and the television murmured in the corner while a card game ran with the kind of attention that pretended to be casual, but was not. A woman in an apron approached and pinched Nico's cheek and told him he was too skinny, and Nico replied that he was built for speed, and she countered that he was built for wind, laughing as she turned back to the kitchen like she had decided that was the correct diagnosis. Nico set the boxes on a side counter and offered the delivery slip, and the heavy-set man checked it quickly and then insisted Nico have a coffee, since it was Christmas week and refusal was not allowed. Nico accepted a small cup of espresso and let the heat travel into his fingers because in winter a hot cup felt like proof that the world still had mercy. At the card table, a man with slick hair and a grin like polished metal looked up and asked if Rosa still made bread that could make a priest confess, and Nico replied that her bread could make a stone cry, and the man laughed and advised him to save that line because it might keep him alive. Nico kept his smile small and let the room be the room, warm and crowded and careful around the edges. An older man entered from a back room holding envelopes and placed them near Nico's boxes with tidy precision, counting them with a focus that suggested the counting mattered more than the paper. His brow tightened when he realized was missing, and he asked where the other lot was, and the heavy-set man asked what he meant, and the older man explained he had 6, and now he saw 5. The room did not go silent, because silence would have been too dramatic, but the laughter thinned and the television seemed quieter, and even the espresso smelled more cautious. The slick-haired man leaned back and suggested maybe the older man forgot it, and the older man insisted he did not forget it. Calm voice with eyes that were not calm, eyes searching for mistakes and excuses. The woman in the apron stopped laughing, and Nico felt tension move through the room like a draft through a cracked window, because a missing envelope during Christmas week could turn warm people into suspicious people in a heartbeat. The heavy-set man kept his tone polite and asked Nico to wait in the hall for a minute, no offense intended, and Nico moved toward the door without taking it personally, because he understood boundaries. Then Nico noticed something under the counter, half hidden by a chair leg, a plain envelope with no writing, and a crease like it had been handled and dropped, and he pointed with his chin and drew attention to it. The older man followed Nico's gaze, bent down, and picked up the envelope, holding it up like evidence in a trial, and letting out a long exhale. Relief arrived but did not fully unpack, because in this world relief always came with a second thought. So the slick-haired man tried to grin and asked how it got there. The older man looked at the heavy-set man, the heavy-set man looked at the woman in the apron, and the woman looked at Nico, and Nico held his espresso with both hands, and wished he could vanish into the steam. The heavy-set man cleared his throat and insisted nobody touched it, and it must have slid because the table was crooked, and the slick-haired man joked that the table had been crooked since the president was young, and when someone asked which president, the man replied exactly, and a few chuckles appeared, forced at first and then real enough to take the edge off. Nico waited while the room chose a story it could live with, because stories were how people solved tension without admitting they had tension. Voices rose from the back room, not angry and not loud but firm, the kind of firmness that kept everyone in line without needing to explain itself. Then the older man returned with the envelope and a different expression, suspicion replaced by something almost sheepish, and he explained it was fine because his wife hid it, worried he would lose it, and she put it somewhere safe, somewhere so safe even she forgot. The woman in the apron crossed her arms and declared that sounded like her, and the room laughed for real, because laughter in a kitchen could turn fear into soup. The heavy-set man exhaled and let the moment settle, stating that nobody was accusing anybody, and the slick-haired man agreed and admitted he was ready to be offended on principle. They teased the older man gently, like family, and he accepted it because he earned it and because Christmas week demanded at least thy humble moment. Nico set his espresso cup down, and the heavy-set man handed him an envelope with payment and a generous tip tucked inside, and Nico tried to protest that it was too much, but the heavy-set man reminded him it was Christmas week, and everyone was pretending to be saints, so they might as well enjoy it. Nico thanked him and tucked it into his inner pocket, and then the heavy-set man walked him toward the door and insisted he take a plate of food, because eating counted as work in winter, and Nico found a warm foil-covered plate placed into his hands like a command wrapped as kindness. Before Nico left, the heavy-set man asked him to pass along Merry Christmas to Rosa, and Nico promised he would, and then the man added that Rosa's bread made people remember their mothers, which was dangerous, and Nico smiled because mothers were the only thing tougher than men who claimed to run the city. Outside, Nico placed the plate on the passenger seat like it was sleeping, started the engine and let it idle while he watched frost melt in slow lines across the glass. As he drove deeper into Brooklyn, he kept thinking about how quickly a room could change, how suspicion stepped in, and how easily it stepped out once someone offered it a harmless story to hold, and maybe that was the real holiday magic in places like this. Not miracles, just good timing and better excuses. He finished 2 more deliveries, one at a corner deli where the owner winked too much, and another at a small bar that smelled like pine cleaner and nostalgia, and each place wrapped its rules in tinsel and pretended the rules were festive. On the way back toward the bridge, Nico passed a church with open doors and warm lights spilling onto the steps, and he watched a few late parishioners step into the cold, with calm faces and collars turned up, and he kept driving because his night belonged to the route. He reached the bakery as the sky began to change colour, faint grey that meant morning would arrive whether anyone was prepared or not. Aunt Rosa looked up from her tray and demanded to know what that smell was, and Nico answered Brooklyn, and she sniffed and declared that Brooklyn smelled like garlic and opinion. Nico set the covered plate on the counter and told her it was for her, and she peeled back the foil and went quiet while she studied the food. Then she studied Nico and concluded that he was making friends. Nico corrected her that he was making deliveries, and Aunt Rosa replied that it was the same thing, because in this city every delivery was a relationship, and some relationships came with more rules. Nico took off his coat, hung it by the door, washed his hands, and helped stack trays, while Aunt Rosa muttered about the world getting lazy and flour not being what it used to be, and Nico listened the way you listen to a familiar song, where the specific words mattered less than the comfort of the sound. Before he left to sleep, he looked out the bakery window and saw the city preparing itself for Christmas, and he knew the city might behave, or it might do what it always did and call it tradition. Nico pulled his scarf tighter, decided he could handle it, and promised himself he would keep driving the route with both hands on the boxes, eyes open, mouth calm, and enough patience to let winter and lights soften the sharp edges for a few nights. Chapter 3: Slippers in Greenwich Village. By the 3rd night, the city had settled into that December routine where everything looked festive, until you stood still long enough to notice how tired people were. The sidewalks held a thin crust of old salt, the air smelled like wet wool and coffee, and the wind moved through the streets like it was checking locks. Nico left the bakery with a smaller load and a longer list, which was Aunt Rosa's version of generosity, because she believed busy hands kept the heart from wandering into trouble. He drove downtown with the heater working hard and the radio low, and he tried to keep his mind in the safe lane where thoughts were simple, like bread, like warm light, like the idea that Christmas was mostly about not making things worse. The route took him toward Greenwich Village, where the streets narrowed and the buildings leaned in close like old friends who wanted to gossip, and where the night had its own pace, slower and softer, with pockets of laughter that felt human instead of performative. Sullivan Street looked calm in a particular way, the way a quiet room looked calm when you knew the people inside were awake. A light fog hung low, not thick enough to hide anyone, just enough to make the street lamps glow like they were remembering something. Nico found a spot without too much fighting, which felt suspicious, so he accepted it quickly and stepped out with 2 boxes tucked against his coat. The delivery note was plain, and the name on it was not a name that meant anything to Nico, which meant it probably meant a lot to someone else. The address led him to a storefront that did not beg for attention, just a door and windows with a modest air, like the place was satisfied with being exactly what it was. Nico knew it by reputation anyway, because people in the neighborhood spoke about it the way they spoke about weather, with a mix of casualness and caution. He did not need to announce it to himself, but his brain offered the name anyway. Triangle, Sullivan Street, the kind of place that did not advertise because it did not need to. A man on the stoop nodded at Nico as if he had been expecting him, and Nico returned the nod, because nods were the safest kind of conversation. The man did not block the door, but the space around him suggested boundaries, and Nico could read those the way he read stop signs. Roses, the man observed, eyes on the boxes. Yes, sir, Nico replied, and he kept his voice steady, not too friendly and not too cold. Inside, the air was warmer than the street and smelled faintly of espresso and citrus peel, and there was that old building scent too, a mix of wood, dust, and time. The room felt lived in, not staged, with chairs that had been sat in for years and a table that carried the marks of countless cups. Christmas decorations were present, but restrained, as if too much cheer might be interpreted as weakness. A small tree stood in the corner, modest, with a few ornaments that looked older than Nico, and a strand of lights that did not blink, because blinking lights were for people who liked drama. Nico placed the boxes where he was directed, and waited with hands relaxed at his sides, letting the room finish evaluating him. That evaluation was not cruel, just thorough, like a bouncer deciding whether you were a problem. A couple of men sat near the back, talking low, and one of them lifted his hand in a casual gesture that still carried authority, and Nico understood the message was, "You are fine, do not make it weird." A door opened from deeper inside, and an older man stepped out wearing a cardigan and house slippers that looked too soft for the mood most people associated with places like that. The slippers were almost funny, which made them a kind of power move, because when you could wear slippers in a room like this, it meant you did not have to prove anything. The older man looked at the boxes, then at Nico, then around the room as if checking whether anyone was taking notes. "Rosa's still baking like she is mad at the world," the older man remarked, voice calm, almost amused. "She bakes like the world owes her an apology," Nico answered, and immediately regretted how accurate that sounded. The older man's mouth twitched into something close to a smile. "That is a healthy attitude. Keeps you warm." One of the men near the back added that Rosa's bread could make a person confess to crimes they had only considered in passing, and Nico gave a polite smile, because the line was funny in the safe way you needed it to be funny. Humor in these rooms was a tool, and the best humor was the kind that let everyone breathe. A man with a neat scarf stepped forward to handle payment, counting bills with quick fingers and placing the envelope into Nico's hand like it was a courtesy rather than a transaction. Nico tucked it into his inner pocket and kept his eyes respectful, because respect cost less than curiosity. As Nico turned to leave, the older man in slippers spoke again, and the room shifted by a fraction, the way it did when someone important decided the next topic. "There is a small favor," the older man said, not a request exactly, more like a gentle statement about the weather. "Someone nearby could use a little help for Christmas, and we're making sure the right people get it without the wrong people making it messy." Nico did not ask which people were right or wrong, because he was not built for that kind of discussion. He simply nodded. The older man continued, explaining that there was an envelope going out with a basket of pastries, and it needed to land with a parish office a few blocks over, without turning into a parade. The older man made it sound like a kindness, which it was, and also like a test, which it might have been, but Nico focused on the kindness, because focusing on kindness kept you safe in bed. A small basket appeared, lined with paper, filled with biscotti, cookies, and one neat loaf wrapped in brown paper, and an envelope tucked under the paper so it did not shout its presence. The basket looked wholesome, which was the whole point, because wholesome was a disguise nobody questioned during Christmas week. Nico accepted it with both hands. Where should it go? The older man gave the address in a calm monotone, and Nico repeated it back, because if you repeated instructions in a room like this, people trusted you more. Then the older man added, almost as an afterthought, that if anyone asked, it was just baked goods, nothing more. And Nico replied that in his life baked goods were always something more, but he understood the assignment. Outside again, the fog had thickened slightly and the streetlights glowed softer. Nico carried the basket to his car, set it gently on the passenger seat, and drove the few blocks at a careful pace, because sudden movement sometimes drew attention, and attention was rarely helpful. He reached the parish office, a modest building beside a church, and found the lights still on, because someone always stayed late in December, sorting donations, filling forms, and trying to stretch kindness far enough to cover a whole neighborhood. Nico climbed the steps, rang the bell, and waited. A woman opened the door, tired eyes, warm voice, and a cardigan that looked like it had survived many winters. She looked at the basket, and her expression softened. A delivery, Nico offered, keeping it simple, and he handed it over with both hands. The woman thanked him and started to step back, and then she paused as if noticing something, not the envelope exactly, but the careful way it was tucked. Her eyes lifted to Nico's face with a question that did not want to be spoken. Nico gave a calm, neutral look and nodded slightly, the kind of nod that promised discretion. The woman's shoulders relaxed, and she took the basket inside as if it was both ordinary and sacred, which was probably true. Nico turned away, feeling lighter, because quiet kindness did that, and he walked back toward his car with his collar up against the fog. That was when he noticed the group of carolers. They were not the church choir, not the gentle, practiced kind. These were a handful of young people in puffy jackets, cheerful in a sloppy way, with cocoa cups and a portable speaker that they insisted was necessary. They were not dangerous, but they were loud, and loud could become dangerous in the wrong block at the wrong hour, especially when the village was full of streets that were small enough for sound to travel and for tempers to hear it clearly. One of them recognized Nico as a person carrying a bakery smell, and decided he was part of the holiday scenery. "Hey, bread guy, join us," the tallest one called, already laughing at his own joke, already convinced the world was friendly. Nico kept walking, hoping the universe would let him exit without conversation, but the group drifted closer, singing off-key and having a joyful time not noticing where they were. Nico considered the street, the fog, the quiet doorways, and the way doors like those preferred calm. A man leaned against a building across the street, hands in pockets, watching. Not obvious, not hidden, just present. That kind of presence was a warning sign, like a dog that did not bark. The carolers, blessedly unaware, started moving down the sidewalk toward a doorway that Nico recognized from earlier, and Nico felt his stomach tighten, because cheerful people walked into trouble the way tourists walked into bike lanes. Nico did not want to lecture anyone, because lectures made people stubborn, and stubborn made the night complicated. He needed a softer solution, something that let the carolers feel like they were winning. He stepped toward them with a calm, friendly pace and a mild expression, like a man who had just remembered an important piece of information. "Listen," he began, keeping his tone light. "This block is not a great stage, the sound bounces weird, and people here have strong opinions about music after midnight. If you want an audience that actually claps, the corner by the cafe on 7th has more foot traffic and more drunk people, and drunk people clap at anything." The tallest one blinked. "What is this, a professional caroler speaking?" Nico gave a small shrug. "I deliver pastry. I learn where people are happy." One of the others, a girl with a scarf wrapped too high, looked at Nico with sudden seriousness and asked if it was really that bad here. Nico did not make it dramatic. He simply indicated the quiet doorway with his eyes and replied that the neighbors were private and tired private neighbors did not need surprise entertainment even in December. Then he added that if they needed a reason, he had been asked to keep it peaceful for a charity drop, which was true enough to work, and truth that worked was the best kind. The carolers hesitated, and the portable speaker made a small squeal as someone adjusted it, and Nico felt the watching man across the street remain still, like a statue that listened. Then the tallest one grinned and declared that they were doing a holiday tour anyway, and they did not want to ruin anyone's life, so they would move on. The group gathered themselves, still cheerful but now with a direction, and they drifted away toward louder streets, where their off-key joy would blend in with other noise. Nico watched them go, relieved, and then he noticed the watching man across the street nod once, small and almost invisible, as if acknowledging good sense. Nico returned the smallest nod back, because nods were the safest kind of gratitude. He got into his car and sat for a moment with hands on the wheel, letting his heartbeat settle back into a sleepy rhythm. The fog made the street feel like a painting. The village felt older than the calendar, as if it had seen countless Decembers and learned which moments mattered and which moments were just noise. Nico finished the rest of his deliveries without incident, a bag of rolls to a late-night diner, a box of cookies to a small office where someone was still working because they did not know how to stop, and a tray of pastries to a doorman who tucked them away like treasure. Each stop felt ordinary, and ordinary was the best kind of success. Back at the bakery, Aunt Rosa was waiting, because she always waited, because sleep was something she treated like a hobby for other people. Nico set the empty trays down and mentioned, casually, that he dropped a basket at the parish office. Aunt Rosa gave him a look that carried question, suspicion, and something softer underneath. Then she sniffed and muttered that charity was good, as long as it did not become a habit that made you soft. Nico did not argue, because Aunt Rosa liked charity best when it looked like discipline. He washed his hands, listened to the ovens, and let the warmth smooth out the night. In his mind the slippers stood out, the quiet confidence of them, the reminder that power sometimes wore soft things and did not apologize. He also thought about the carolers, how easily good intentions wandered into the wrong doorway, and how a gentle redirect could keep everyone safe without humiliating anyone. He stood lost in as he beheld power and showed up on the minutation in them. He also thought about the carolers, how easily good intentions wandered into the wrong doorway, and how a gentle redirect could keep everyone safe without humiliating anyone. Nico leaned against the counter, eyes heavy, and let the bakery hum slow his thoughts. Christmas was coming, and the city was still itself, but for a few nights it seemed to agree to keep the sharp edges wrapped. Chapter 4: Ozone Park Ornaments. Queens felt different at night, not quieter exactly, but wider, with streets that breathed and blocks that gave you room to think, which was sometimes a blessing and sometimes a trap. Nico did not mind the drive because driving was the part of his job where he could stay alone with the heater and the steady rotation of streetlights. Aunt Rosa handed him the delivery list with a stern face and a small warning that the Queen's Run needed care, because people out there liked to do Christmas bigger, and bigger meant heavier boxes, and heavier boxes meant more ways to look foolish. Nico loaded the car with the usual plain cardboard plus Molly's special box marked only with a tiny dot of red tape, a code that meant do not crush, do not tilt, do not ask question, and definitely do not arrive late. Nico did not ask what the box held. The bakery business taught you that curiosity was a luxury, like front row seats at a show you did not need to see. He took the highway east, watching Manhattan shrink behind him into a cluster of lights, and he followed the familiar signs toward Ozone Park. The air out here carried different smells, more garages, more winter smoke, more trees pretending they were not in the city. Houses were decorated with determination, strings of lights wrapped around railings, inflatable figures bobbing gently, and wreaths thick enough to look like they had opinions. He turned onto a residential street where the snow had been shoveled into neat piles and the sidewalks were clearer, which suggested people cared about presentation. Nico parked and checked the list again, because Queen's pride could be a serious force. The address belonged to a modest row house with a bright porch light and a small set of ornaments that had been placed with an exactness that felt almost military. Nico stepped out with 2 boxes and the special red tape box balanced carefully on his forearm like a fragile promise. Before he reached the steps, the door opened, and a woman stood there wearing a holiday sweater that was aggressively cheerful. Her hair was pinned up, Her eyes were sharp, and she looked like she could host a party while simultaneously running background checks. "You are Rosa's driver," she stated, not asking. "Yes, ma'am," Nico replied, polite and calm because the tone in her voice suggested she could destroy him with a sentence. "Good," she replied, stepping back to let him in, and he entered a warm house filled with the smells of cooking and the sound of people trying to pretend they were relaxed. Christmas music played low, a television murmured in another room. Children's laughter floated down a hallway and then cut off abruptly, which meant an adult had given them a look. Nico set the boxes on a table near the entryway. The woman checked the list and nodded, then pointed at the special red tape box. "That one goes to the back," she instructed, and her voice softened slightly, as if the box mattered in a sentimental way. Nico carried it through the house, passing a living room where a couple of men sat with coffee cups and calm faces, and a kitchen where trays of food seemed to multiply by the minute. Everyone looked festive, but the festive look had structure, like a uniform you wore to keep the peace. He noticed eyes track him and then drift away, the way people watched a delivery and then decided it was not worth extra thought. In the back room, a small Christmas tree stood beside a sideboard, decorated with ornaments that looked old, the kind that had survived moves, arguments, and decades. The woman gestured to a clear spot, and Nico placed the red tape box down carefully. He did not open it, he did not touch the tape. He simply stepped back as if the box might be fragile in a way that went beyond glass. A man entered the room then, middle-aged, calm voice, neat hair, wearing a sweater that looked like it was trying to be casual. He nodded at Nico and thanked him for coming out in the cold, then added that Rosa's bakery kept the holidays civilized, which sounded like a compliment and also like an instruction to everyone else to behave. Nico returned a polite smile and kept his posture neutral, because neutral was safe. The woman handled payment in the doorway, counting bills with efficiency and sliding the envelope toward him. Then she hesitated, and her eyes flicked to the list again. "Hold on," she muttered, and her fingers traced the paper. "This is missing something." Nico felt the first brush of tension, soft but real, like a draft under a door. He leaned in to look, careful not to crowd her. "What is missing?" he asked quietly, because quiet questions did not wake the whole house. The woman tapped the list with one finger. There was supposed to be a second tray, the small one, the one for the old man, she stated, and her voice had that particular sharpness of someone worried about embarrassment more than about food. Nico checked his remaining boxes in his mind and felt his stomach sink a little, because he remembered seeing a small tray earlier, and then he remembered leaving it on the counter at the bakery when Aunt Rosa called his name and he turned too fast. That kind of mistake did not seem dramatic, but in certain houses it could feel dramatic, because it suggested you were careless, and careless was not a good label to carry. Nico did not try to deny it. He admitted he might have left it behind, and that he could fix it, and the woman's eyes narrowed, not in anger exactly, but in that controlled way people narrowed their eyes when they were calculating how much trouble a mistake could cause. In the living room, one of the men looked up, hearing the edge in the conversation. The room did not go silent, but the music seemed suddenly too cheerful, which was always a bad sign. The woman explained that the small tray was missing, and that it was meant for an older relative who would notice, and who would not want to hear excuses. The man listened and nodded, then looked at Nico with a quiet steadiness. "Can you get it?" he asked, and the question was simple, but the expectation underneath it was not. "Yes," Nico replied, and he meant it, and he added that he would be back quickly and that the bakery was not far. The man nodded again, and Nico felt something loosen, because the man's calm made the mistake feel manageable instead of fatal to his pride. Nico excused himself and stepped back into the cold. As he walked to the car, he noticed a parked sedan down the block with two people inside, faces lit faintly by the dashboard, sitting still like they had nowhere to be. It could have been anyone, but the stillness had a particular flavor, the same flavor as idling cars in Manhattan, and Nico decided to treat it as background. In sleep-friendly stories, the background stayed background. He drove back to the bakery with care, not racing, because racing turned mistakes into bigger mistakes. Aunt Rosa was in the middle of pulling trays from the oven, and the bakery smelled like warm sugar and discipline. I left a tray, Nico admitted immediately, because Aunt Rosa respected confession more than excuses. Aunt Rosa did not gasp. She did not shout. She simply stared at him in a way that made the air feel heavier. "Which tray?" she asked, and the words sounded like a judge preparing a sentence. "The small one," Nico replied, "the one that was labelled for the old man in Queens." Aunt Rosa inhaled slowly, and Nico could almost hear her patience stretching. Then she turned, opened a cabinet, and pulled out a replacement tray already prepared, because Aunt Rosa planned for human error the way generals planned for weather. She slid it into a box, taped it with the bakery's cheap tape, and then added an extra bag of biscotti, because she understood social repair. "Take this too," she instructed, and when Nico looked confused, she added that when you bring a mistake back to a proud house, you do not bring only the missing item, you bring proof that you care. Nico thanked her, genuinely, and Aunt Rosa waved her hand as if gratitude was a distraction. "Go," she told him, "and do not let their Christmas feel smaller because your eyes were sleepy." Nico drove back to Ozone Park with the tray secured on the seat like a precious thing, and he kept his mind calm, because calm was a tool. When he turned onto the street again, the parked sedan was still there, and the people inside were still faces in dim light. Nico parked, stepped out, and carried the replacement tray and the extra biscotti to the door. The woman opened quickly, as if she had been listening for footsteps. Nico held the box out with both hands and apologized without being dramatic, explaining that it was his mistake and that he brought the tray plus something extra from Aunt Rosa to make up for it. The woman's expression remained firm for a moment, then softened by a fraction, the way ice softened when you stopped touching it. "Good," she said, and she accepted the box as if she had accepted a truce. Inside, the man in the sweater appeared again, and Nico handed him the extra biscotti with a brief explanation that Aunt Rosa insisted. The man's eyes warmed slightly, and he nodded as if acknowledging that Rosa understood the rules of dignity better than most people did. The older relative was not in the entryway, but Nico heard a voice from deeper in the house, a gruff voice that carried authority without effort, asking if the bakery came through. The woman called back that it did, and the gruff voice replied that Christmas should never depend on amateurs, which sounded rude until it also sounded like relief. The tension eased, and the music felt less sarcastic again. Nico took his payment envelope, thanked them, and excused himself before the house had time to assign him any additional meaning. As he stepped outside, he noticed the parked sedan finally roll forward and move on, slow and quiet, as if the street was done paying attention. Driving back, Nico felt the night return to its wider Queen's rhythm, and he let himself enjoy the small success of fixing the mistake without turning it into drama. He thought about Aunt Rosa's replacement tray and the extra biscotti, about how repair was sometimes at another delivery, and he liked that idea, because it made the world feel manageable. Back at the bakery, Aunt Rosa watched him enter and noticed immediately that the box was gone. "Fixed," Nico confirmed, keeping it simple. Aunt Rosa nodded once, and that nod was her way of saying you are still employable. She returned to her work, and Nico washed his hands and helped stack trays until the sky began to lighten behind the windows. In the calm before morning, Nico thought about the ornaments he saw in that Queen's house, old glass and careful placement, decorations that survived because people chose to keep them. He also thought about mistakes, how quickly they could grow, and how quickly they could shrink again if you carried them with honesty and a little extra care. He leaned against the counter, listened to the ovens, and let his thoughts slow into something soft and sleepy. Christmas was close, and the city was still full of sharp edges, but for a few nights the edges seemed willing to be wrapped. Chapter 5. The Quiet Rules of the 5 Families in December. The 5th night of Christmas week arrived with that particular New York cold that felt personal, like the city had remembered your name and decided to test your scarf. The sidewalks held old salt and new grit, and the air tasted like coffee and exhaust and something faintly metallic that Nico insisted was just his imagination trying to be dramatic. Aunt Rosa did not believe in dramatic, so she handed him the delivery list with a flat look that translated to, "Do your job and do not become a story." This route was mostly Manhattan again, with one stop written in Aunt Rosa's small, careful handwriting, the kind she used when she was thinking hard. There was no recipient name, just a corner near Canal and a reminder written underneath that Nico should knock only once and then wait, because repeated knocking was for people who wanted attention. Nico did not want attention, so he promised himself he would knock once like a professional, and then let the silence do the work. The bakery was extra warm tonight, ovens running steady, trays cycling like a calm machine, and the counter full of orders for offices, doormen, and families who were trying to buy holiday peace in the form of sugar. Nico loaded plain boxes, then much heavier box wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, which looked old-fashioned and deliberate. Aunt Rosa watched him lift it and warned him that if he dropped it she would not unalive him, because that would be merciful. She would simply keep him alive to wash dishes until retirement. Nico took that threat seriously, mostly because it was realistic. The drive downtown was slow, not because the streets were jammed, but because the city moved like it was saving energy for Christmas. Lights hung over storefronts, wreaths sat on doors, people walked faster than usual, heads down, protecting warmth and private plans. Nico kept both hands loose on the wheel and kept his mind in the safe lane. He did not try to decode the city. He just tried to deliver bread. Near Canal, the buildings looked older and closer, the air more crowded even when the street was empty, and the noise of traffic turned into a low, constant hum. Nico found a parking spot that felt suspiciously easy, which meant it would probably be expensive in some invisible way later, but he took it anyway. He stepped out into the cold with 2 boxes, and the heavier wrapped package balanced carefully, and he walked to the address that was not really an address, just a doorway that looked like it belonged to nobody in particular. A man stood near the door, not blocking it, just making it clear that the door had preferences. He looked like every other man in a winter coat, except his eyes were doing quiet math, and his calm felt practiced. Nico nodded. The man nodded back, and that was the whole conversation, which Nico appreciated. Nico knocked once, soft and precise, and then waited. The door opened enough for a face to appear. The face recognized Nico immediately, which meant the bakery was on time more often than Nico realized. The door opened wider and Nico stepped into a hallway that smelled like espresso and old heat, and somewhere deeper inside voices murmured at a low tempo, careful and controlled. He followed the hallway to a back room where a table sat under modest light, and people sat around it in the way people sat when they wanted to look relaxed while still paying attention. The faces were not all familiar, but the mood was familiar, steadier than normal, like everyone had agreed to behave for the season. Christmas decorations existed, but only barely, a small wreath on a wall and a few strands of lights that did not blink, because blinking suggested excitement, and excitement suggested mistakes. Nico set the boxes down on a side counter and waited for someone to direct him, because in rooms like this you waited to be told where to stand. A man with neat hair approached and glanced at the bakery slip without touching it too much, then counted payment with quick fingers and placed an envelope into Nico's hand like he was granting a favor rather than settling a bill. Nico tucked it into his inner pocket and kept his eyes polite. Before Nico could leave, a voice from the table called him over, not sharp, not demanding, just certain. Nico walked closer and stopped at a respectful distance. The men at the table looked ordinary in the way people looked ordinary when they were trying to make a point. One wore a wool coat still buttoned, as if he did not trust the room. Another wore a sweater that did not match the seriousness of his eyes. A third wore reading glasses and looked mildly annoyed by everything, including Christmas. The man with the glasses studied the wrapped package and asked, in a tone that suggested he already knew the answer, if that was from Rosa. Nico confirmed it was. The man nodded as if a small piece of his night had finally aligned correctly. Good, he replied, because we are trying to keep things calm. Someone else at the table added that calm was hard to find in New York, and even harder to keep, especially when people were shopping, drinking, and pretending family dinners were not stressful. The line earned a few quiet smiles. Nico kept his expression mild, because his job was bread, not commentary. The man with glasses continued, explaining in a calm, dry way that December had rules, even for people who did not enjoy rules. There was no need to list the rules like a lecture, because the room already knew them, but the way he spoke made it feel like a reminder passed around like a tray. The holidays were a time to keep noise down, keep pride contained, and keep business from spill into public places where it would become both tacky and inconvenient. Nico listened without leaning in too much because leaning in suggested interest, and interest was expensive. He heard a phrase about the families, said casually as if it was about weather, the old structure that everyone in the city pretended not to know while quietly respecting it. It was not a romantic thing, it was not even a noble thing. It was simply a set of habits built over decades to prevent chaos from becoming messy. Nico thought about it the way he thought about traffic lights. You did not love them, you just appreciated that they existed. The talk around the table stayed low and steady. Someone mentioned charity events, church drives, and quiet envelopes that went to the right places without creating a spectacle. Someone else mentioned that Christmas week was not the time to prove a point, because proving points in December made everyone look bad, and nobody liked looking bad in front of family. That earned another small round of smiles, because even serious men respected a good line about family pressure. Nico stood there holding his calm posture and letting the room talk around him like a river. He caught the gentle sarcasm and understood its purpose. Humor softened the edges and kept the temperature down, like opening a window in a crowded kitchen. Then the soft tension arrived, not with a shout, but with a small shift in the room's breathing. A man at the far end of the table leaned forward and mentioned a rumor that someone outside the room was getting restless, that a small disagreement might spill early, before Christmas, which would be rude and also inconvenient. The man said it like a complaint about bad manners, and that made it scarier, because it implied the disagreement was real enough to be worth addressing. The man with glasses did not react much. He simply asked which disagreement. The other man gave a name Nico recognized from the neighborhood stories, a surname that traveled quietly through certain blocks, and Nico immediately forced his mind to focus on bread again, because he did not need details. Someone else at the table made a quiet observation that this week was already full of eyes. The city had more watchers than usual, more vans parked in odd spots, more people pretending to read newspapers while listening with their entire face. Another man replied that the city always had eyes, but December eyes were extra hungry, because holidays made people sloppy, and sloppy made headlines. The talk stayed calm, but Nico could feel the room tightening and relaxing in small cycles, like the ovens back at the bakery. The men wanted to keep the peace, but peace required discipline, and discipline required everyone to agree at the same time, which was always the tricky part. A man in a wool coat shifted and spoke in a low voice that sounded patient, as if he had said the same thing 100 times over the years. He reminded the table that the rules existed for a reason, and that Christmas week was not only for families at home, but also for families outside, meaning the neighborhoods, the old people, the kids, and the store owners who relied on calm to survive the month. He did not call it kindness, he called it sense, because sense was a language this table respected. The man with glasses asked if anyone had heard specific trouble, not a rumor, something tangible. The answer was mostly no, which was both comforting and annoying. Rumors were like smoke, they made you cough without showing you the fire. Nico kept his eyes down and waited for the moment when someone would let him leave. He did not want to be the delivery driver who became part of a serious conversation. He wanted to be a footnote, the way bread should be, present and helpful but not dramatic. Then the door to the hallway opened and a younger man stepped in, breath visible from the cold he carried on his coat. He glanced at the table, nodded quickly, and delivered a quiet update that a car had been sitting outside longer than normal, and that the car did not belong to anyone local. The younger man did not sound frightened. He sounded mildly offended by the inconvenience, which was worse, because it meant this was normal enough to be annoying. The man with glasses nodded, then said something that made Nico almost smile, because the sarcasm landed like a warm blanket. He observed that Christmas brought out the best in people, and the most patient in watchers, and everyone should be grateful for patience because it was rare. A couple of men gave soft, amused exhalations, not quite laughter, but acknowledgement. The conversation turned practical. Someone suggested that if there was tension brewing, the reasonable approach was to wait until after Christmas and then handle it quietly, without turning the holiday into a scene. Someone else agreed and added that if anyone insisted on making trouble before then, they would be treated like a person who played loud music on the subway, which was not a direct threat, just a deeply insulting comparison. The table seemed to like that, because it framed the problem as bad manners rather than tough talk, and that kept the tone bedtime safe. Nico stood there thinking about subway music and agreeing internally that it should be illegal. The man with glasses finally looked at Nico and dismissed him with a small wave, as if Nico had been an extra chair that someone had remembered to put away. Nico gave a polite nod, picked up his empty slip, and headed for the door with calm steps, making no sudden moves, because sudden moves made people watch you longer than necessary. In the hallway, the man who owned the air opened the door for him without making it a big deal. Nico stepped outside, and the cold hit him again. Across the street, a vehicle sat idling, not obviously suspicious, just still, as if it was waiting for the city to make a mistake. Nico did not look directly at it. He looked at the street lights and the wet pavement and the small piles of snow that had not melted yet. He walked to his car, started the engine, and let the heater kick in. He told himself he was just a delivery driver and that whatever happened in rooms like that was not his concern. Which was true, but the city did not always care what was true. The city cared what was near you. He finished the rest of his route, a tray of rolls to a diner that never slept, a box of cookies to a doorman who accepted it like a tip of morale, a loaf to a small office where a tired person worked late and looked genuinely grateful for something warm. These stops reset his brain, because ordinary work had a soothing weight. Near the end of the night, Nico passed a church with lights on and a small line of people waiting to drop off donations. He thought about the table he had seen, about the talk of rules, and about how sometimes even hard people wanted the same thing as everyone else, which was a week where nothing exploded and everybody got to pretend the world was safe for a few days. Back at the bakery, Aunt Rosa waited behind the counter, lips pressed tight, sleeves rolled up, looking like a woman who had outlived the concept of rest. Nico set the empty trays down and tried to sound casual when he mentioned that the canal stop felt busy. Aunt Rosa gave him a long look, the kind that asked questions without using words. Then she sniffed and replied that busy was not the same as bad, and that December made everyone act foolish, including people who claimed they never acted foolish. Nico washed his hands, helped stack trays, and listened to the ovens breathe. The bakery felt safer than the street, not because it was innocent, but because it was honest. Bread was bread. Sugar was sugar. Heat was heat. People were the complicated part. In the quiet before morning, Nico thought about rules again, not the rule of the street, but the rule of the season, the quiet agreement that Christmas should not be ruined by pride. He wondered how long that agreement could last in a city like that, and then he decided he did not need the answer tonight. He just needed sleep and a world that stayed calm until his next shift. He leaned against the counter, watched flowers settle in the warm light, and let his thoughts slow down like the last minutes of a lullaby. Chapter 6. The Fruitcake Job. On the 6th night, Aunt Rosa announced there would be a fruitcake, and she said it in the same tone other people used when they announced incoming weather. Nico had grown up believing fruitcake was a myth, like affordable rent, but Aunt Rosa treated it as a serious object with a serious purpose. She placed the ingredients on the counter with a precision that suggested she did not trust any of them, especially the fruit. "This is not a joke fruitcake," she warned, and her eyes held the kind of threat that made ovens behave. Nico nodded and kept his hands away from the bowls, because he had learned that when Aunt Rosa looked like that, even breathing too close to the batter could be interpreted as sabotage. She mixed slowly, deliberately, and the bakery filled with a rich smell of butter, spice, and a sweetness that felt old-fashioned, the kind of sweetness that did not apologize for being heavy. The fruitcake baked for a long time and emerged dense and glossy, wrapped in a careful layer that made it look almost formal. Aunt Rosa tapped it lightly with a knuckle and seemed satisfied by the sound, like she had just checked a safe was locked. Nico watched and pretended he understood fruitcake physics. "This is for a man who appreciates tradition," Aunt Rosa explained, and then she added that the man also appreciated punctuality, and that punctuality would be Nico's problem. She wrapped the fruitcake in brown paper, tied it with string, and placed it into a box that she taped with extra care, even adding a second layer like she was sealing a small vault. The delivery slip was minimal, as usual, and the address pointed to a quiet area with detached houses and long driveways, which meant the destination was either very normal or very not normal. In New York, both could be true at once. Nico carried the fruitcake box to the car with both hands and set it on the passenger seat like it was fragile, even though the cake itself looked capable of surviving an earthquake. Aunt Rosa warned him not to tilt it, not to stop abruptly, and not to let it out of his sight, because if anything happened to her fruitcake, she would keep him alive just long enough to regret his career choices. Nico promised, and she narrowed her eyes as if promises were suspicious. Then she waved him out the door because time mattered to her in a way it did not matter to other humans. The streets were calmer tonight, the city smoothing itself toward Christmas, and Nico drove with careful patience. He made a couple of small stops first because Aunt Rosa did not let what special job cancel regular work, and by the time he headed toward the fruitcake destination, he had warmed up into the rhythm of the night, the routine of boxes and nods and quiet exchanges. The destination street was lined with trees wrapped in lights, tasteful and steady, not the blinking kind that screamed for attention. Nico parked and checked the box again out of pure habit. The tape was intact, the string was tight. The fruitcake remained a serious object in a serious box. At the door, a man answered who looked like he had been built from patience and gym memberships. He stepped aside to let Nico enter, and the inside of the house was warm with the smell of coffee and something savory, a kitchen working hard for Christmas. Nico set the fruitcake on a clean counter and watched the man inspect it, not opening it, just verifying it existed and had arrived on time, which seemed to satisfy him. He handed Nico an envelope with payment and a tip that suggested fruitcake carried emotional value in this house. Nico thanked him and left with quiet steps. In the driveway, he allowed himself one small smile, because a successful delivery of a dangerous baked good felt like winning a minor award. The smile did not last long. When Nico reached his car, the passenger seat was empty. For a moment, he just stood there looking into the car, as if the fruitcake might be hiding under a blanket. The seat was bare. The box was gone. The empty space looked wrong, like a missing tooth. Nico felt his stomach drop with a slow, heavy certainty. This was not a normal problem. This was not a problem you solved by checking under the seat. This was a problem that grew legs and ran. He looked around the street. The lights were steady. The houses were calm. There was no obvious movement, no person jogging away with a fruitcake box, which would have been a hilarious sight if it did not involve Aunt Rosa's promise of lifelong dish duty. Nico took a breath and forced his mind into problem-solving mode. He replayed his actions, step by step, because memory was a tool when panic tried to take over. He arrived, parked, checked the box, carried it inside, set it on the counter, watched it get inspected, accepted payment, walked back out. He did not carry the box back out because he had delivered it. So why was it missing now? Then he understood, with the clarity that arrived only after fear and confusion had finished their little dance. He had brought the fruitcake back out. The man at the door had inspected the box without opening it, then guided Nico toward the entryway while casually talking about the weather and traffic, and Nico, always eager to be polite, had picked up the box again automatically, like a waiter collecting a plate, and carried it back to the driveway without thinking. The fruitcake did not belong to his muscle memory. It belonged to his anxiety. Nico put a hand on his forehead and whispered a short apology to the universe. Now the question was where he set it down. He looked at the driveway, the porch steps, the side path, and then the street, and he saw nothing. He checked the porch corner. Nothing. He checked beside the mailbox. Nothing. The fruitcake had vanished in the brief window between his mistake and his realization. Nico walked back to the door and rang the bell, keeping his expression calm, because calm was the only thing that kept this from turning into a scene. The same man answered, eyes narrowing slightly as he took in Nico's return. Nico explained, carefully and quietly, that he believed he had accidentally carried the fruitcake back outside after delivering it, and that now it was missing. He framed it as a confusion because confusion sounded harmless, and harmless sounded solvable. The man stared at Nico for a long second, then stepped aside and motioned him in. Inside, the kitchen voices softened. A woman peeked around a corner. Someone turned down the music. The air changed. The man asked Nico to repeat the story slower. Nico did, choosing words like they were fragile. The man listened, then walked Nico back outside to the car, scanning the driveway and the street like a person looking for something that should not have legs. A second man appeared, older, wearing a cardigan, face calm in a way that suggested many problems had arrived at his doorstep over the years. He listened to the situation and sighed, a gentle sigh, more tired than angry, and that was almost worse than yelling because it implied Nico had interrupted a life already full of nonsense. The older man asked Nico what the box looked like. Nico described it: brown paper, string, extra tape, a serious box with a serious vibe. The older man nodded slowly and glanced down the street. Then, in a tone almost conversational, the older man observed that a fruitcake like that was not attractive to a normal thief, because a normal thief wanted a phone, a bicycle, or a package from an online retailer, not a heavy box of old-fashioned cake. He added that if someone took it, the someone probably did not understand what it was, and that misunderstanding could be fixed. Nico appreciated the older man's logical approach, because logic did not unalive him with embarrassment. Logic gave him steps. They walked down the sidewalk slowly, scanning bushes and porch corners, and the older man pointed out a truth Nico had not considered, which was that the neighborhood had kids who wandered, and kids had a special talent for picking up anything that looked like a present. Christmas week pushed that talent into overdrive. As if summoned by the idea, a small figure appeared at the end of a driveway, a boy maybe 10 or 11, wearing a winter hat pulled low. He held something behind his back and tried to look casual, which was a mistake because casual was hard when you were small and guilty. The older man did not raise his voice. He called the boy's name, not harshly, just firmly, and the boy froze like a rabbit, pretending the street was invisible. The older man asked what the boy was hiding. The boy hesitated, then slowly revealed the fruitcake box, still tied, still taped, looking slightly ashamed of being involved in this situation. Nico felt relief so sharp it almost made him dizzy. He kept his face calm anyway, because the boy was not a villain, just a kid operating under holiday logic. The older man asked the boy why he took it. The boy explained, in a rush, that he saw the box on the driveway and assumed it was a present left out by mistake, and he did not want it to get ruined by snow or stolen by someone else, so he hid it in his family's garage to keep it safe. He said it with intense sincerity, the sincerity of a kid who believed he had done the right thing and was now learning the adult world had complicated rules. Nico almost laughed, but he did not, because laughing would shame the boy, and shame was not necessary. The older man nodded slowly and told the boy that the intention was good but the method needed improvement, and that if he wanted to be helpful, he should ask first, because asking was what separated a helper from a problem. The boy nodded so hard his hat nearly fell. The older man turned to Nico and asked him to check the tape. Nico inspected the box carefully. The string was intact. The tape was intact. The fruitcake remained sealed and serious. Nico thanked the boy, keeping it simple, and told him he appreciated the intention. The boy looked relieved, then looked embarrassed again, because embarrassment was the tax you paid for learning. The older man added that the boy's family would bring a plate of cookies to the house tomorrow as an apology, and the boy nodded again because he clearly wanted a way to make it right. They walked back toward the house with the fruitcake now back in Nico's hands, heavy and confident as ever. At the door, the man with the gym membership calm watched them return, and Nico explained that it was a neighborhood kid trying to protect the box. The man listened, then exhaled, and his shoulders dropped as if an invisible weight had finally been removed. Inside, Nico set the fruitcake down again, and this time he kept his hands far away afterward, like the box had learned to bite. The older man in the cardigan inspected the string and tape, then nodded with quiet satisfaction. He did not smile, but the room warmed in a way that signaled the crisis had ended. The woman in the kitchen returned to her cooking. The music went back up slightly. The house recovered its holiday posture. Nico stood there for a moment, feeling like a person who had survived a foolish moment without being permanently banned from bread society. The older man addressed Nico with calm dryness, and noted that fruitcake was an excellent test of discipline, because it was heavy enough to be noticed, and boring enough to be ignored by most criminals. Nico replied that he would remember that, and the older man observed that Nico would remember it whether he wanted to or not, which was true. Nico apologized again for carrying the box back out by mistake. The older man waved it away gently, and pointed out that mistakes happened, and what mattered was how quickly you corrected them without making a public performance. Nico agreed, because public performance was the opposite of sleep. Before Nico left, the man with the gym membership calm handed him a small bag of coffee beans as a thank you for fixing the situation, and Nico accepted it, because refusing kindness during Christmas week was illegal in certain houses. Driving back toward the bakery, Nico kept both hands on the wheel and tried to let the adrenaline settle. The city looked calmer now, lights steady, streets quiet, and he felt grateful that the worst thing that happened tonight involved fruitcake and a kind-hearted kid instead of something sharper. At the bakery, Aunt Rosa saw Nico walk in and immediately asked with narrowed eyes whether the fruitcake had arrived safely. Nico confirmed it had, then admitted there was a moment in the middle where the fruitcake tried to escape into the night, but it had been recovered without drama. Aunt Rosa stared at him. Then she stared longer. Then she made a sound that might have been a laugh if she allowed herself that kind of softness. "A fruitcake does not escape," she corrected him. "People escape fruitcake." Nico agreed, because it was a perfect line and Aunt Rosa deserved the win. He placed the coffee beans on the counter as an offering of peace. Aunt Rosa nodded once, accepting it as proof that Nico's mistake had not become an embarrassing story for the bakery. Nico washed his hands, helped stack trays, and let the warmth smooth out the night. He thought about the boy with the hat, about the instinct to protect a gift, and about how Christmas made people behave oddly, sometimes badly, but sometimes in a way that came from a good place. As the ovens hummed and the bakery settled into its steady breathing, Nico leaned against the counter and let his thoughts slow down, returning to simple things, warm bread, soft light, and a city that one more night chose quiet over chaos. Chapter 7. Christmas Eve at the Ravenite. Christmas Eve in New York carried a special kind of quiet that was never fully quiet, the way a crowded room could fall into a hush without emptying out. The street still moved, the buses still sighed at corners, and the city still hummed, but everything sounded muffled, wrapped in winter and expectation. Nico left the bakery earlier than usual because Aunt Rosa believed Christmas Eve should be managed, not survived, and she had arranged the route like she was planning a parade nobody was allowed to watch. He loaded the car with the usual plain boxes and extra bag that Aunt Rosa pretended was for him but was obviously for her, because she had a soft spot for pretending she did not have soft spots. The snow from earlier in the week had settled into grey piles, and the air smelled like cold stone and coffee, and a little like pine whenever the wind passed a street vendor who had decided trees were an acceptable side hustle. As Nico drove toward Manhattan, he noticed the city looked dressed up, lights hanging across streets and wreaths on doors, but the faces on the sidewalks looked tired, because Christmas made people sprint emotionally even when they stood still. He kept his radio low and his mind calmer than the traffic, repeating the safe and simple truth that he was only delivering bread and pastry, and that bread and pastry could not get him into trouble unless he did something foolish like flop a box open in public. Little Italy was awake in a careful way when he arrived, with clusters of tourists who wanted a holiday story and locals who wanted everyone to go home. Garlands drooped from awnings, and the streetlights put soft halos on the pavement. Nico found parking near Mulberry Street with the kind of luck that felt like suspicious generosity, and he stepped into the cold holding 2 boxes against his coat. He walked the first few deliveries like a quiet ritual. Wayne stopped for a cafe that would stay open until someone finally remembered sleep. Another stop for a restaurant that insisted it only wanted bread and definitely did not want gossip. And then a final stop written in Aunt Rosa's handwriting with no name and an address that did not need a name. The closer he got, the more he felt the neighborhood tighten, not in fear but in attention. There were more people standing around than usual for a December night, and they did not stand like tourists. They stood like people waiting for someone to look at them, to acknowledge them, to confirm they existed. They spoke softly and laughed carefully, and tried to look casual while doing the opposite. Nico recognized the pattern. He had seen it at a distance before, the way certain nights turned a simple sidewalk into a stage, and he did not love it because stages invited accidents. He kept moving anyway, because he had boxes in his hands and a job that did not excuse itself. Near the small doorway there was a polite line, not roped off, not official, just formed by people who knew how to form lines when it mattered. Some held shopping bags, some held wrapped packages, some held nothing but hope and a desire to be noticed. A few men in good coats stood near the front, guiding the flow with gentle gestures, not pushing, not shouting, just steering, the way a person steered a dog away from a puddle without embarrassing the dog. Nico approached the door and nodded to the familiar man who owned the air. The man's coat looked the same, his hair looked the same, and his eyes looked like they were doing even more math tonight. Busy night, Nico offered, keeping it neutral. Christmas Eve brings out everybody, the man replied, and the tone suggested that everybody included people who should have stayed home. Nico handed over the boxes with both hands. The younger man in the scarf appeared, took them carefully and gave Nico a quick look like a person sharing a private joke without words. The hallway was warmer than the street and smelled of espresso and citrus peel, and beyond a door Nico heard voices and laughter and the scrape of chairs, a room full of people trying to look relaxed. The younger man checked the bakery slip and prepared payment, then paused and leaned in slightly, voice low and amused. "Some people think they are doing a good deed tonight," he murmured. Nico kept his face calm. "People are in the mood. People are always in the mood for something," the younger man replied, then added that tonight the something was attention. Nico tucked the payment envelope away and turned to leave, because leaving was his favorite part of any stop. The man who owned the air opened the door for him and Nico stepped back into the cold. He expected to walk straight to his car, but he noticed the van first. It sat down the block, plain enough, the kind of van you could ignore if you wanted to ignore it, but the van had the stillness of a person pretending not to listen. Nico saw the slight glow inside, like a dashboard or a small light, and he saw the way it was parked with too much intention. Nobody stepped out, nobody moved. It was the kind of presence that made the sidewalk feel narrower. Nico kept walking, eyes forward, posture calm, as if vans had no meaning in the world. He told himself he was imagining it, because imagining it was safer than confirming it, but his instincts stayed awake. A man near the line spoke to another man, and Nico caught fragments, a mention of Christmas, a mention of respect, and a mention of a certain name spoken softly, the way people spoke a name when they wanted it to feel like a door opening. Nico had heard the name 1,000 times in the neighborhood, sometimes whispered, sometimes joked about, sometimes spoken like a prayer, and sometimes like a warning. John Gotti. The name travelled through Little Italy like winter wind, always present, always shaping how people held themselves even when they pretended it did not matter. Nico did not pretend he knew anything official. He only knew what the neighborhood assumed, that there was a new energy in the air, and that Christmas Eve had become one of those nights when people wanted to be seen near the center of it, like moths toward a porch light. Nico reached his car and sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel, letting his breath slow. He did not like stages, and he did not like crowds, but he liked that the night was still polite, still mostly soft, still behaving like a holiday. He started the engine and pulled away for his next delivery, moving through narrow streets with careful patience. He stopped at a doorman building, handed over a box of cookies, nodded to a tired security guard, and accepted a quiet thank you that sounded genuine. Ordinary stops like that helped him reset, because ordinary was the best medicine for nerves. But as he circled back toward Mulberry again for one last bakery errand, he found himself caught in the edge of the crowd. The sidewalk had thickened with people, and the line looked longer, and the air felt thicker too, like everyone was breathing the same story. Nico parked farther away and walked because sometimes you needed to approach a scene on foot to feel where the safe edges were. He kept his collar up and his gaze calm, and he moved like a person who belonged, because belonging was often just a matter of not looking confused. Near the doorway a small commotion began. Not a fight, not a shouting match, just a ripple, the way water rippled when something shifted beneath the surface. A man in the line spoke too loudly, and another man politely reminded him that loud voices were not necessary tonight. The loud man tried to laugh it off, but his laugh sounded defensive, and defensive laughs were the kind that turned into problems if you let them. The man who owned the air stepped closer, not aggressive, just present, and he spoke with the calm tone of a person delivering weather news. He suggested that Christmas Eve was a night for family, and that family did not need to raise its voice on the sidewalk. The loud man's shoulders dropped, and he nodded, suddenly remembering manners. The ripple faded. Nico watched and felt grateful that the correction was gentle. He preferred gentle. Gentle let everyone keep their pride and go home. The van down the block remained still. A second vehicle appeared farther away, parked in a way that looked ordinary until you noticed the angle. Nico saw a man in a plain coat lean against a lamppost and pretend to look at nothing while his eyes scanned everything. The sidewalks had more watchers than usual tonight, the kind of watchers who carried patience like a profession. Nico delivered his final box to a small apartment nearby, a tray of rolls for a family that insisted on feeding everyone who walked through their door. The grandmother who answered looked exhausted and happy, like she had been cooking since the beginning of time. She thanked Nico and pressed a cookie into his hand like a blessing, then closed the door before the cold could steal any more warmth. Back outside, the crowd on Mulberry was still there, but it had softened, less restless now, as if the excitement had found a rhythm. Nico walked slowly past, not stopping, and he noticed something small and oddly comforting. A man near the doorway was handing out small wrapped items to a few kids. Not flashy, not loud, just a quiet gesture, like someone trying to make sure the neighborhood remembered Christmas could be ordinary too. The kids looked at the packages with wide eyes and then ran off squeaking with delight. The scene looked almost wholesome, which in this context felt like a deliberate choice. The slow voice Nico recognized from earlier nights drifted out from inside the door. Not loud, but clear enough to carry. It remarked that Christmas should be protected from bad manners, because bad manners ruined everything and also made people look cheap. Someone chuckled. Someone else agreed. The tone stayed light, sarcasm doing its gentle work. Nico kept walking, letting the sound fade behind him. He did not need to be closer. The night did not require his presence. His role was bread and distance. As he reached the corner, he noticed the van finally move, rolling forward slowly, turning with controlled patience. Not racing, not fleeing, just repositioning like a chess piece. Nico did not watch it too long. He preferred not to know too much about how the board was arranged. On the drive back to the bakery, the city looked calmer again, as if it had completed a ritual and could now return to its normal level of chaos. Nico felt the tiredness settle into his shoulders in a soft wave. He liked that tiredness. It meant he had done his job and nothing strange had attached itself to him. At the bakery, Aunt Rosa stood behind the counter with her arms crossed, waiting the way she always waited, as if sleep was a rumor. Nico set down his last slips and handed her the cookie the grandmother pressed into his hand, because Aunt Rosa accepted gifts best when they came from older women and carried the energy of a kitchen. Aunt Rosa eyed the cookie, then eyed Nico, then declared that Little Italy was getting too theatrical, that people should stay home on Christmas Eve and let the bread speak for itself. Nico agreed because agreeing with Aunt Rosa was always the safest holiday tradition. He washed his hands, helped stack trays, and listened to the ovens breathe. Outside, the city kept moving, but slower now, wrapped in winter and whatever stories people took home with them. Nico let his thoughts settle into simple shapes: warm bread, soft light, and a night that managed to stay mostly polite even with so many eyes watching. Chapter 8: Sullivan Street Switcheroo. The night after Christmas Eve felt like the city had exhaled. Not completely, because New York never exhaled completely, but enough to make the streets sound less tense. The holiday rush was still present, but the sharpest anticipation had passed, and people walked with a softer purpose, carrying leftovers and new sweaters and the vague relief of having survived family time. Aunt Rosa arrived at the bakery before Nico, and acted as if that was normal, which was not normal but was also not something anyone tried to correct. She had a short list tonight and a particular look in her eyes that Nico recognized as the look she wore when she was about to volunteer him for something he did not ask for. Before Nico could ask, she placed a folded bundle on the counter and told him to put it on. Nico unfolded it and realized it was a Santa suit, not the bright, fluffy kind from department stores, but an older one, slightly faded, with a hat that had seen many winters and a beard that looked like it would itch on principle. Nico stared at it and tried to communicate refusal with his face. Aunt Rosa stared back and communicated that refusal was not on the menu. "It is for a good thing," she explained, meaning it was already decided. Something quiet, something kind, and something that required you to look harmless. "I already look harmless," Nico replied, because sarcasm was the only weapon he carried. Aunt Rosa replied that he looked harmless the way a tired cat looked harmless, and that tonight he needed to look like a holiday postcard. She handed him a small paper bag of cannoli and a neatly wrapped box of cookies, then gave him an address on Sullivan Street and reminded him, in case he forgot, that he had already been on Sullivan Street recently and survived, so he could survive again. Nico changed in the back room of the bakery with the grim patience of a man putting on a costume for a child's birthday party. Except the child in this case was the whole neighborhood. The Santa suit fit poorly in the shoulders and too well in the waist, which made him look like Santa had been quietly working out. He put on the hat, adjusted the beard, and tried not to breathe too much through the fake hair. Aunt Rosa looked him over, nodded once, and declared it acceptable. Then she warned him not to get flour on the suit because the suit belonged to someone who would notice. Nico did not ask who. He grabbed the bags, kept the beard from tangling with his scarf, and walked out into the cold. Driving in a Santa suit felt like asking the city to comment on you, and New York loved comments. Nico kept his windows up and his radio low, hoping the darkness would hide him. It did not. At stoplights, people turned their heads, not in awe, but in that amused way New Yorkers had when they saw someone else living a worse moment than they were. A cab driver gave him a thumbs up. A pedestrian laughed. Nico accepted it as his punishment for agreeing to be fested. Sullivan Street looked quieter than Christmas Eve, still carrying that soft village fog that made streetlights glow. Nico parked and checked the bags, cannoli intact, cookies secure, and then he pulled the Santa hat lower and stepped out, hoping the dark would cover the dignity he had lost. Near the familiar storefront, the triangle place with its quiet posture, Nico did not go in. He walked past it slowly, because he had learned that doors like that preferred subtlety. He turned into a side street and headed toward a modest building with a narrow entryway, the kind of place where families lived close together and the walls had absorbed decades of voices. Aunt Rosa's instructions were simple. The bag of cannoli and the cookies were a gift for a family upstairs, a family that had been having a hard winter, and the goal was to deliver it like a whisper. No fuss, no speeches, no attention, kindness that did not demand applause. Nico climbed the stairs and paused on the landing, listening. He heard a radio playing softly behind Dunn's door, and behind another he heard the muffled sound of a television and a child asking a question that did not get answered right away. He found the apartment number Aunt Rosa provided and set the bags down gently in front of the door. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card, plain paper with a simple note written in Aunt Rosa's handwriting, which was somehow both stern and warm at the same time. It wished the family a quiet holiday and reminded them that the neighborhood still noticed them, which was Aunt Rosa's way of being tender without becoming sentimental. Nico placed the card on top of the cookies and stepped back. Now he needed to leave without being seen, because being seen turned a gift into a moment, and moments could embarrass people who were already tired. He started down the stairs, moving slowly because Santa boots were not built for stealth, when he noticed someone on the street below. A man in a plain coat stood near the corner, hands in pockets, face calm and eyes watchful. He did not look like a neighbor coming home. He looked like someone waiting for the world to explain itself. Nico felt a small chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He told himself he was being dramatic, that the village had plenty of people who stood around doing nothing and calling it art, but the man's stillness was too deliberate. It carried the same flavor as the van on Mulberry, the same patience, the same quiet attention. Nico reached the sidewalk and started walking toward his car, forcing his posture to stay casual even though casual was difficult when you were dressed as Santa and carrying the emotional weight of a secret gift. He kept his eyes forward and his pace steady. The plaincoat man turned and began walking too, not directly behind Nico, but with a matching rhythm, like a person following without announcing it. Nico did not like it. He also did not want to run because running as Santa would turn the entire block into a comedy show, and comedy shows attracted witnesses. Nico turned a corner, then another, making small adjustments to his path, and the plaincoat man adjusted too, maintaining distance the way a patient fisherman maintained line tension. Nico felt annoyance rise in him because being followed was rude, and rudeness on a night like this felt unnecessary. He reached his car and opened the door slowly, as if he had all the time in the world. The plaincoat man stopped across the street and pretended, very badly, to examine a parked bicycle. Nico got into the car and sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel, letting his brain decide what kind of problem this was. Maybe the man was bored, maybe the man was watching the general area, maybe Santa suits triggered suspicion in certain professions. Nico tried to keep his imagination in the safe lane, but the safe lane was narrow. He started the engine and pulled away gently, then circled the block once, not to escape, but to confirm the pattern. The plaincoat man did not chase, but Nico saw him turn his head to watch the car, and Nico understood that the man was collecting information, not pursuing adventure. Nico drove back toward the bakery for a normal delivery to reset his nerves, stopping at a small cafe to drop off bread to a tired barista who looked like she had been working since the 19th century. The barista stared at the Santa suit and asked, with dead calm, whether this was Nico's new career choice. Nico replied that it was a temporary humiliation, and the barista laughed, which helped, because laughter made the night feel less sharp. When Nico returned to the car, he noticed the plaincoat man again, farther away now, standing under a streetlight as if he had always belonged there. Nico did not like that the man was still near his orbit, and he decided the best solution was to finish the night quickly, return the suit, and let the holiday weirdness dissolve. He made 2 more deliveries, both simple, one to an apartment building where a doorman accepted a box of cookies as if it was currency, another to a small office where a tired person thanked him so sincerely it made Nico feel briefly like the world was not entirely cynical. Then Nico realized something that made his stomach tighten. The family gift on Sullivan Street was still sitting on that landing. He had left it, yes, but he had not heard the door open, had not heard footsteps, had not heard anyone take it inside. The point of the gift was to get it safely into the home, not to leave it as a decoration for the stairwell. Nico turned the car around and went back, annoyed at himself for forgetting the most important part, which was completion. On the drive, he tried to imagine a gentle way to finish the delivery without embarrassing the family. He could knock and step back quickly. He could ring the bell and leave. He could pretend he had the wrong door and walk away. New York offered endless strategies for doing things while pretending you did not do them. At Sullivan Street, Nico parked and climbed the stairs again, slower this time, listening harder. The bags were still there, the card was still on top. Nobody had taken them. The hallway air felt cooler than before, as if the building itself had been holding its breath. Nico stood for a moment, then decided that quiet kindness sometimes needed a small nudge. He knocked once, gently, and stepped back, turning his head slightly so he would not stare directly at the door. He waited. Footsteps approached. The door opened a crack. A woman's voice asked who it was, cautious but not harsh. Nico kept his voice calm and low, and explained that he had a holiday delivery, and that it was for them, and that there was no charge, no need to sign, just something from the neighbourhood. The door opened wider. A woman in a worn sweater stood there, eyes tired, holding the door like she was not sure she could afford to trust it. Behind her, Nico saw a small living room and a child peeking around a corner with a curious face. The child's eyes widened at the sight of Santa in the hallway. Nico lifted the bag slightly and told them it was cannoli and cookies, and he added that it was meant to be simple and quiet and that they did not need to do anything else. The woman's expression shifted, confusion to understanding to something softer she tried to hide. She asked where it came from. Nico replied it came from people who cared about them, which was true enough, and he did not name Aunt Rosa because Aunt Rosa preferred her kindness anonymous, like a professional. The child stepped closer and stared at Nico's beard with suspicion, and Nico lowered his head slightly in a gentle nod, letting the child feel included without turning it into a performance. The child smiled, small and surprised. The woman accepted the bags with both hands. Her voice got quieter. She thanked Nico, then added, almost like an apology, that they were out earlier and they did not hear anything, and that she worried someone might take it. Nico told her nobody took it, and that it was safe now, and he wished them a calm night. As Nico turned to leave, he saw the plain coat man at the bottom of the stairs through the window, standing on the sidewalk and looking up at the building like he had been waiting to see what Santa did next. Nico felt a flare of annoyance again, because even kindness had an audience tonight, and that felt intrusive. But then the plain coat man did something Nico did not expect. The man looked at Nico through the glass, held Nico's gaze for a brief beat, and then gave the smallest nod. Not friendly, not threatening, just acknowledging that the scene was exactly what it looked like, a quiet gift, not a show. Then the man turned and walked away, unhurried, hands in pockets, disappearing into the village darkness like a thought you decided not to keep. Nico stood for a moment in the stairwell, letting that settle. He did not know who the man was, and he did not need to. He only knew that sometimes watchers watched, and sometimes they also chose to let a small kindness stay private. He went back to his car, drove to the bakery, and returned the Santa suit with relief, peeling off the hat and beard like he was escaping a bad dream where he had become a seasonal mascot. Aunt Rosa took the suit, inspected it for flour, and declared it acceptable, then asked if the drop was done. Nico confirmed it was done, and that the family received it, and he kept the rest of the story minimal, because minimal made it sleep-friendly, and also because Aunt Rosa did not enjoy long explanations. Aunt Rosa nodded once, then muttered that Christmas did not need big speeches, it needed warm food and the discipline to leave people dignity. Nico washed his hands, helped stack trays and listened to the ovens breathe. The bakery felt steady, honest, and safe in the way warm rooms felt safe when the city outside felt watchful. Nico leaned against the counter and let his thoughts slow down, focusing on simple things, sweet smells, soft light, and a night where Santa, against his will, managed to do something quietly good. Chapter 9: Midnight Mass and the Long Walk Home. After Christmas Eve, the city did not suddenly become innocent, but it did soften in the way a tired person softened after they finished pretending to be cheerful for a full day. The streets kept moving, but with less urgency, and the sidewalks looked like they were waiting for the week to end so everyone could stop forcing their smiles. Nico left the bakery later than usual, because Aunt Rosa finally allowed the ovens a shorter shift, and because there were fewer deliveries once families had already eaten, argued, forgiven each other, and eaten again. Nico drove through Manhattan with the heater working hard and the radio low, watching people carry leftovers in foil and gift bags that looked like their handles had been tested by disappointment. The air smelled like cold stone and coffee, and every now and then it smelled like pine when the wind passed a tree stand that still had work to do. The city lights were still up, but the glow felt quieter, and the traffic sounded less impatient, as if even the horns were taking a small holiday. Tonight's route was simple: a few late bread drops, a tray of cookies for a doorman who had worked straight through the holiday, and a small box marked in Aunt Rosa's careful handwriting with a note that read, "Deliver after service, do not rush." Nico did not ask what service. He already knew what she meant, because neighborhoods like this had rhythms older than the calendar, and Christmas week ended the same way for many families, with church, candles, and a brief attempt to be better. He parked near a church in Lower Manhattan, where the steps were worn smooth by generations of winter shoes. The doors were open and warm light spilled out, turning the cold air near the entrance into something gentler. Nico sat in his car for a moment, hands resting on the wheel, listening to the faint sound of singing inside. The singing was not loud. It was steady, a sound that did not ask for applause. It reminded him that some people did not need the city to agree with them in order to keep doing what they believed. Nico took the small box and stepped out. He did not go inside because he was not dressed for it, and because he preferred to stay on the edge of things where you could be useful without becoming involved. He waited near the side of the steps, letting the cold keep him awake, and watched people arrive in quiet clusters. Some were older couples holding hands like they had decided not to argue this week. Some were families with kids who looked half asleep and half curious. Some were men in good coats who walked with that careful posture that suggested confidence and caution at the same time. Nico recognized a few faces from his route. Men he had seen in social clubs, men he had seen leaning near doorways, men who looked like they belonged to the neighborhood in a way that tourists never could. Tonight they looked different, not softer, but more human, as if church gave them permission to be unremarkable for an hour. They nodded at familiar people, they held doors, they kept their voices low. They blended into pews like sons and uncles, which was probably exactly what they were to someone. Nico told himself that was the strangest part of this city. Not the rumors, not the watchers, not the quiet doorways, but the way people could carry two lives without dropping either wed. He did not judge it too hard. Judging was loud, and Nico preferred quiet. The service continued. Warm air drifted out each time the door opened, and Nico caught fragments of prayers, the rhythm of language meant to calm the mind. He noticed a woman near the entrance handing out small candles, and he watched a man in a wool coat accept ones with a careful expression, like he was not sure he deserved a flame. The man cupped the candle anyway and stepped inside. Nico waited, hands in his pockets, and kept his thoughts simple. Aunt Rosa believed church was useful, not because it erased mistakes, but because it reminded people they had limits. Nico liked that idea. Limits were comforting. Limits made the world feel less chaotic. As the service neared its end, the doors opened more frequently. People stepped out slowly, faces calm, talking in low voices, careful not to break the mood too abruptly. The cold hit each person like a reminder that the city was still itself. Nico watched a few kids grin and then quietly get shushed, and he saw an older woman laugh into her scarf, as if laughter was also a kind of prayer. Two men emerged and moved to the side of the steps near where Nico waited. They did not notice him at first, or they noticed him and decided he was furniture, which Nico considered a compliment. One man was older, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked carved by winter and decisions. The other was younger, neat hair, calm eyes, and a coat that fit too well to be accidental. They stood close enough to speak quietly, and the city noise covered their words just enough to feel private. Nico did not try to listen. He tried not to listen. But certain tones carried, and certain names carried, and the human brain had a bad habit of catching them even when you asked it politely not to. The older man spoke first, voice low and controlled, and the younger man replied with the same careful calm. The subject was not church. The subject was something unfinished, a grudge that had been waiting for a time that felt appropriate. The older man's tone suggested he was tired of waiting, The younger man's tone suggested he understood, but also that tonight was not the night. Nico heard the older man mention that the year was running out, and that some things should not be carried into January, because carrying them into January made them heavier. He heard the younger man answer that Christmas week was a boundary, and that boundaries mattered, and that if someone crossed it now, they would look like a person who tried to start a bar fight at a child's birthday party. The comparison was insulting in a way that worked, because it made the problem sound like bad manners instead of tough talk. The older man exhaled and said something about pride. The younger man replied that pride did not keep you warm, and that warmth was the point of this week, even for people who did not know how to admit it. There was a pause, and Nico could almost feel the older man deciding whether to push. He did not push. His shoulders dropped slightly, and his voice grew quieter. He said he would wait, but only because waiting was the smarter move, and he did not want to give anyone a reason to make a spectacle. He said it as if he was doing someone else a favor, which was probably how he needed to say it to accept it. The younger man nodded and replied that after the holidays they could talk like adults and handle whatever needed handling in a way that did not embarrass families, neighbors, or the block. He added, with a faint edge of sarcasm, that the city already had enough people embarrassing themselves for free, and they did not need to compete. The older man gave a quiet sound that might have been agreement. Then he turned his head slightly and noticed Nico for the first time, or pretended to. His gaze moved to the small box Nico held. "Delivery?" the older man asked, not demanding, just curious. Nico nodded calmly. "For the parish office, after service," and then he added that Aunt Rosa insisted on timing, because Aunt Rosa liked to be accurate even when the world was not. The younger man's mouth twitched in something like a smile. "Rosa always insists." The older man looked Nico up and down, then gave a short nod that felt like a conclusion. Nico stayed still and polite, because still and polite was the safest posture in any season. The two men moved away, conversation finished for now, and Nico watched them merge into the slow current of people leaving church. The mood outside remained calm, and Nico felt a strange kind of relief, not because grudges were good, but because someone had chosen to delay one. Delay, in this city, could be a kind of mercy. Nico walked the small box to the parish office door around the side, where a tired staff member waited with a ring of keys and a grateful expression. Nico handed over the box with both hands. No fuss, no speech, just a quiet exchange. The staff member thanked him and told him to have a calm holiday week, and Nico replied that he would try, which felt like the most honest promise anyone could make. After that, Nico decided to walk for a while before returning to the car. The night was cold, but the kind of cold that kept your thoughts clear. He moved through the neighborhood at an unhurried pace, listening to the city without letting it pull him into any story. He passed apartment windows glowing with soft light. He passed a corner deli where the owner stood in the doorway smoking and looking at the street like it was a television show. He passed a group of young people laughing too loudly, then lowering their voices as they reached a quieter block, because even they seemed to understand that Christmas week asked for gentleness. As Nico walked, he thought about the men outside the church. He thought about how they spoke like people who had learned not to waste words, and how they still argued about pride like everyone else did, just with different stakes. He wondered how many grudges were held in this city like heavy coats, worn out of habit even when the weather did not demand them. He wondered whether anyone ever put them down permanently. Then he thought about Aunt Rosa, about her rules and her oven heat and her quiet insistence that food could hold a neighborhood together better than speeches. He thought about the families he had delivered to all week, the ones who wanted holiday peace more than anything else. He thought about the kid who tried to protect a fruitcake, and the family on Sullivan Street who accepted a quiet gift without being forced into gratitude theater. Those were the moments that felt real. By the time Nico returned to his car, his mind had slowed into a calmer place. He drove back to the bakery with steady hands. Aunt Rosa was there, of course, because sleep was something she treated like a rumor. She looked up, saw the empty slot where the small box had been, and nodded once, satisfied that the delivery had been completed properly. Nico hung his coat, washed his hands, and helped stack trays until the ovens quieted. In the last stretch before morning, he found himself thinking again about boundaries, the boundaries people made in December to protect the holiday from their worst impulses. He did not know if those boundaries lasted, but he appreciated that they existed, even briefly. He leaned against the counter and let the warmth wrap around him, listening to the bakery hum like a lullaby. Outside, the city kept moving, but slower now, as if it too had decided to postpone trouble until after everyone had a chance to sleep. Chapter 10. The Morning After. Coffee and Consequences. The last chapter of Christmas week did not arrive with fireworks. It arrived with morning coffee, folded newspapers, and that particular hush that settled over New York when people finally stopped performing and started cleaning up. The streets looked the same, but the energy felt different, like the city had taken off its holiday sweater and returned to its normal uniform. Nico woke later than usual, which felt luxurious and slightly wrong, and he drove to the bakery under a pale winter sky. The sun was weak and honest, the kind that did not pretend to warm you. The traffic was steady but not aggressive, and people moved as if they were carrying invisible lists of errands, returns, and emotional repairs. At the bakery, Aunt Rosa had already been awake long enough to have opinions about the entire day. The ovens were on but calmer. The counter was less crowded. The air smelled like coffee and cinnamon and the last lingering sweetness of the holiday rush. Aunt Rosa handed Nico a cup of coffee without asking if he wanted it, because she was not a person who asked questions with obvious answers. Nico accepted it with both hands and took a slow sip, letting the heat settle him. "You look tired," Aunt Rosa observed, as if she had not been responsible for most of the tiredness. "I look festive," Nico replied, and then he added that festive was a form of exhaustion. Aunt Rosa made a small approving sound, which was her way of admitting the line was decent. Then she told him the deliveries today were light, a few offices that never stopped, a couple of doormen who needed thanks, and one stop that was not on the usual list, a stop she wrote in by hand with careful letters. When Nico glanced at it, he felt that familiar tightening in his stomach, because the address was near where trouble liked to stand and pretend it was just having coffee. It was not the Ravenite doorway itself, but close enough to carry the same neighborhood weight. The note from Aunt Rosa was simple. Drop this envelope at the cafe on the corner, do not wait, do not chat, then come back. Nico looked at the small envelope she placed beside his coffee. It was plain, sealed, and heavier than paper should feel. Not wildly heavy, just heavy enough to suggest it contained something more than a greeting card. Nico did not ask what it was. He did not want the answer. He trusted Aunt Rosa's judgment, and he understood that the bakery survived by being useful without being noisy about it. He put the envelope into his inner pocket, the safe pocket, and loaded the car with the day's boxes. The city outside looked washed clean by cold air. Christmas decorations still hung on some streets, but they looked tired now, like they had done their job and wanted to retire. Nico made the first deliveries quickly, a tray of rolls to a diner where the cook looked half asleep and grateful, a box of cookies to a building where the doorman accepted them like they were a salary bonus, a loaf to a small office where someone thanked Nico with the tired sincerity of a person who had worked through every holiday without noticing. Then Nico drove toward the last stop, the cafe on the corner near Mulberry, and he kept his mind calm, because calm made the city feel simpler. He parked, stepped out, and walked toward the cafe with the envelope warm against his chest. Not from heat, but from the way his body held tension. Inside, the cafe smelled like espresso and toasted sugar. A few people sat quietly at tables, and the counter staff moved with that steady efficiency that belonged to places that served neighborhood regulars. Nico approached the counter and asked for a coffee to go, because buying something made you look normal, and normal was always helpful. As he waited, he noticed a man seated near the window, plain coat, calm posture, eyes scanning the street with the patience of someone who preferred observation to conversation. The man looked familiar in the way a shadow looked familiar when it had followed you more than once. Nico recognized him as the plain-coat watcher from Sullivan Street, the one who nodded and then walked away. Nico did not stare. He simply let the recognition exist quietly, like a thought you filed away. The man noticed Nico anyway, because watchers were not paid in imagination. He turned his head slightly and held Nico's gaze for a brief beat. His expression stayed neutral, not friendly, not threatening, just measured. Nico kept his own face calm and gave a small nod, the kind that acknowledged the world without inviting it closer. Nico received his coffee, thanked the barista, and walked toward the corner where a small rack held napkins and sugar packets. He placed the envelope there in a spot that looked accidental, then stepped away, because the instruction was not to wait and not to chat. He left the cafe with a steady pace, and he felt a small relief as soon as cold air hit his face, like the outside world had reset his head. He made it halfway to his car before the plain-coat man stepped out of the cafe behind him and spoke, keeping his voice low and polite. Nico. Hearing his name from a stranger was never a good feeling. Nico turned slowly and kept his expression neutral, because neutral was safe. The man approached with hands visible and posture calm, the posture of someone who did not want a scene. Up close, he looked tired, not in a dramatic way, just in the way a person looked when he had spent too many nights sitting in cars, watching streets, waiting for people to make mistakes. "You do bakery deliveries," the man observed, and it sounded like a statement of fact rather than a question. "Yes," Nico replied, keeping it simple. The man nodded. "I have seen you do a few things this week, and you did them the careful way." Nico did not answer quickly, because quick answers sometimes became traps. He waited, letting the man say the next part without being pushed. The man continued, still polite, explaining that he liked careful people, because careful people did not make problems bigger than they needed to be. He suggested that Nico had access to rooms and corners of the neighborhood where regular people did not wander, and that access could be useful information for someone trying to keep the city calm. Nico felt the offer forming before the man finished speaking, like thunder you heard before rain arrived. It was not a dramatic offer, not a movie line. It was a quiet invitation to become something Nico did not want to become. The man phrased it gently, saying that if Nico ever noticed something that felt wrong, something that might lead to trouble, he could share it, not for glory, not for money, just to prevent headaches for everyone. The man did not say police. He did not need to. His tone carried the shape of that world. Nico breathed in slowly and held the coffee cup steady. He understood the man's logic. He also understood that agreeing would pull him into a current that did not end where he wanted to end. Starting was easy. Stopping was the hard part. Nico answered with quiet respect. "I am only a delivery driver, and my job is to bring bread, take payment, and go home, and I try to keep my eyes on the sidewalk so I do not trip." The man watched Nico carefully, as if deciding whether that was truth or performance. Then he nodded, not angry, not offended, just accepting the boundary. "Fair," the man replied, and he added that the city needed people who stayed in their lane, because sometimes the lanes were all that kept the street from becoming chaos. He paused, then asked one more thing, still polite, still low. "That envelope you just dropped, that is bakery business, right?" Nico kept his expression calm and answered that it was not his business, which was the truth, and also the safest truth. The man stared for a moment, then gave the smallest nod as if acknowledging that some doors stayed closed. "Good luck," the man said, and he stepped away, returning to the sidewalk with the quiet patience of someone who knew he would be watching these streets long after Christmas decorations came down. Nico stood still for a few seconds, letting his heartbeat settle. Then he got into his car and sat with both hands on the wheel like he was holding himself in place. He did not feel heroic for refusing. He felt relieved. Relief was enough. He drove back toward the bakery, but before he reached it, he noticed a familiar car behind him for a block, then 2 blocks, then 3. Not speeding, not chasing, just present. Nico did not panic. Panic was noisy. He took a few turns that did not belong to his route, and the car mirrored them, patient as a fisherman. Nico felt irritation rise, because being watched was rude, and he had been watched enough this week to last a lifetime. He drove toward a busier street where the city had more witnesses and more normal noise. Then he pulled into a spot near a corner store and got out calmly, coffee cup in hand like he had all the time in the world. The car behind him stopped. A man stepped out, not the plain coat watcher, a different man. Neat hair, good coat, posture confident. Nico recognized him as the man who owned the air near a certain doorway. The man approached without aggression, face polite, as if he was about to ask for directions. "You have been doing good work," the man observed, and the tone suggested this was not just about bread. Nico kept his voice calm. "I do deliveries." The man nodded as if that was the correct answer. Then he explained in a casual way that still carried weight that reliable people were rare, and the neighborhood liked reliable people, especially people who knew how to keep their mouths calm. He mentioned that there were opportunities for a driver with Nico's discipline, opportunities that would pay better than pastry runs, opportunities that came with respect as long as you respected the rules. Nico understood. This was the other invitation, the one from the opposite direction, dressed as a compliment. Nico kept his posture steady and thanked the man for the kind words, then answered that he already had a job and a boss who would miss him, and that he preferred to work around flour and ovens because flour did not argue and ovens did not ask favors. The man studied Nico's face for a long beat, searching for fear, pride, or aggression. Nico offered none of those. He offered tired sincerity. Finally, the man gave a small nod, not angry, not insulted, just acknowledging that not everyone wanted a bigger life. "You are smart," the man observed, and then added, "Smart is quieter than brave, and quieter lasts longer." Nico accepted the line because it sounded like advice and also like permission. The man stepped back, adjusted his coat and turned away, walking off with the calm confidence of someone who did not doubt his own world. Nico got back in his car and drove to the bakery, feeling like he had walked between two doors that both wanted to claim him, and he was grateful he had kept walking. At the bakery, Aunt Rosa took one look at his face and knew the day had been complicated, because Aunt Rosa could read a face the way she read oven temperatures. "Someone talk to you?" she asked, voice flat. Nico kept it simple. Two someones, and both wanted me to become noisier than I am. Aunt Rosa made a sound that could have been amusement. Then she reminded him that quiet was a skill, and that skills needed protection. She took his empty coffee cup, threw it away like it was evidence, and told him to wash his hands and get back to stacking trays, because trays were honest and people were not. Nico did as told. He washed his hands, stacked trays, and listened to the ovens breathe. The bakery felt like the only place in the city that did not ask him to be anything else. He thought about the invitations, the careful, polite way both sides offered him a bigger role, and he felt grateful that he could refuse without having to be dramatic. Refusal, done calmly, was its own kind of dignity. Before he left for the day, Nico noticed Aunt Rosa counting the register with her careful fingers, then writing notes in her small handwriting. She looked up and told him that the holiday week was over, and that now the city would return to its usual nonsense, so he should get sleep while he could. Nico agreed. He put on his coat and stepped outside. The winter air felt clean and sharp. The lights on some streets were already coming down, and the city looked like it was packing away its temporary softness. Nico walked to his car with calm steps and a quieter mind. He did not know what the next week would bring, and he did not need to. For now he had bread to deliver, a bakery to return to, and a life small enough to fit comfortably inside his own chest. He started the engine, let the heater warm up, and drove into the city as if the city was just a city, not a stage, not a board, not a test. In the rearview mirror, the bakery window glowed softly, steady and warm, like a promise that did not need to be announced.